Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our live session today. My name is Larissa. I'm an event planner at Reactor, joining you from Brazil. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. The session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand here on the Reactor YouTube channel within 48 hours. Keep an eye on the chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer. I will now turn it over to our speaker for today. So let's welcome Jochen here with us.
Hello, and welcome back. Welcome to our session number 8. Thanks for my colleague last week for handling the Azure security session. But we're at session number 8 now, so there's just a few of these sessions to go. And once again, just a reminder, these sessions are virtually introductions into these topics. We cannot spend too much time if we've got an hour on these sessions. So you cannot prepare for the exam and the certification by just spending an hour on each of these topics. If you go into the learn material, you will see that they go into some detail there, right? Show us some REST queries and things like that for the storage accounts. What does this mean? How do you update this? Is it a put? Is it a get? That sort of thing. So this is one of my favorite topics, but I probably say this quite a lot, API management. And just for our agenda briefly, we will do an introduction to API management. We will talk a little bit about policies. We will talk about securing APIs using subscriptions and certificates. This is a big part of what this learning path is about, is applying security to these different APIs. And then we'll talk a little bit about a bit of a wrap towards the end as we conclude this session about API management services. Now, I want to maybe start by making just a couple of drawings here, if it'll make sense. API management is a comprehensive service that allows you to manage API requests as they are coming into your API or as they are going out to external APIs. So wherever there is some sort of an API, right? Let's say that this is our API, and let's say that this API exposes a bunch of operations, then essentially API management services will sit on top of that. In other words, traditionally what might happen is people might be building applications. There's application 1, there's application number 2, there's application number 3, and traditionally all 3 of these applications will talk directly to those operations and then return the data from these operations. All right? Now, with API management services, what we are referring to is taking this scenario here, and as opposed to plugging in, any of these items and plugging these applications in directly with API management service with my API, what I might do is I might choose to plug in something like API management services here. I'm going to undo that. It's just going to be easier to do it like this. With API management services, we basically plug in what's known as the API gateway. And the gateway basically acts as a type of a facade on top of your API, right? So the gateway facade will also have these operations, typically. And your requests from your calling applications are inherently going to be made to these endpoints now. And of course, these endpoints are merely going to forward these requests to the backend and back. Okay, so in API management terms, this is seen as the front end, and this is seen as the backend. All right, the backend typically is where all your processing is happening. So this is where your code actually executes and takes the request and processes this data in this backend API. Front-end API, merely a wrapper that sits on top of your API, and this is the functionality that API management services brings to us. Now, I want to if I can maybe just move away from the course material for a second, I always like to say that there's two different ways of thinking about something like this. It might be your API, and I'm probably going to draw this quite a couple of times. It might be your API, and you might want to, manage your API and the requests to your API by, for example, in saying, well, there's a business unit, there's the sales business unit, there's the marketing business unit, there's all these different business units or even customers, right, that are wanting to access my API, and I implement API management services in front of that. There's the pen here, right? So this is a very, well, hang on, let me just use the other pen and ask me where it is. This is a very common use case. You've got an API, and you either want external teams, external parties, external companies, consumers of your API. You want them to use your API, but you want to control how they use your API, right? This is one scenario. So the other scenario is if it's not your API, right? This is maybe an external API. So in this example, maybe this is something like the Twitter API. And for the Twitter API, or X as it's called now, for the Twitter API, maybe your marketing department is very interested in that. I just want to cough quickly. Maybe your marketing department has decided to go and buy some licenses for the Twitter API. So this is an external API that might be managed by a complete separate third party, right? And then internally, your marketing department is going to say to your sales department, and is going to say to your IT department, and all the other departments in your organization, they're going to say, well, you can use this API, but we're not going to give you the key to the Twitter API. We are, in fact, going to throttle you so that each of you can just make 10 requests per minute. So in this case, what we will do is we will implement API management services on an external API, and then we will allow these internal departments to access that API based on the conditions that we set for them. And you'll see a little bit later on, we'll talk in a lot more detail about how to secure these APIs, because there's different mechanisms that you can use to secure these different APIs. Of course, you're not just always going to have a scenario where your APIs are open for everyone to be consuming. All right. So I do want you to, they're not outlining this in the exam and content exactly like this, but these are two completely different use cases for API management service. You've got the API, you want to evolve that API. You've got an external API, and they evolve the API. You want to control access to that external API. Right. So these two use cases are quite common, and it's it's a very simple tool to implement on top of all of these. Now, so just introducing API management here, you'll notice that I've got a slide here that covers most of these different building blocks. There you can see I mentioned the gateway, the front end. And by the way, we can have this either in the cloud, which is the default, but we can also implement one of these API management services on-prem. So we've got an on-prem gateway that we can implement as well. So that's the front end. We've also got the backend, or the API, where the work is done. There's the service, right? And there's a management plane around that. I'll demonstrate some of this for you, but we've also got something called the developer portal. All right, so before we've got something called products and groups. I'll talk through all of these, and I'll pop back onto these slides as we talk through these different services. All right, so let's provision one of these API management services and take a look at what it looks like. Now, I've already provisioned one because these can take a little bit of time to be provisioned. But generally, what you're going to do is you're going to set up some of the parameters here. You can see the resource name, for example. Ooh, let me just bump my font slightly. It's a bit small, isn't it? There you can see the resource name, the organization name, the different pricing tiers that I might want to use. And you'll notice if I go for different pricing tiers, Some of them have SLAs. Well, only one of them doesn't have an SLA, but you can see we've got different SLAs based on that. The number of scale out units we can use. So this is basically almost like compute that I can give to my API management services. Cache, X amount of cache per unit. A developer portal. Some of them have got a developer portal. Some of them don't have a developer portal. We'll talk about most of these in a bit more detail later on. So you choose that. That is going to define what your SLAs and other capabilities and features are. And you'll notice that if I go for the standard tier, I can go and choose, hey, how many of these units of processing really do I want? If I choose something like the developer tier, you can see the developer tier doesn't even have that option, right? So I'm not going to create this now, so I'm not too concerned. But next, you can see I can link it up with a log analytics workspace. I can add Defender for APIs with regards to Microsoft Defender for Cloud, so you can monitor some of these, these APIs in that context. And we can also point it off to App Insights. And with App Insights, we're essentially going to map out everything and take all these requests and feed it into an Azure Application Insight service where you can go and query some of those events and look at what else is happening on those different requests. So, well, in actual fact, I do want to show you the rest here. There's the monitoring component, some virtual network integration, and then also some managed identity if I wanted to assign a managed identity to this service. In order for something like that to, in order for this API management service is essentially to communicate out with something like an Azure Event Hub, it'll need its own identity. All right, so this will take some time to provision, and you'll notice if I click on this existing API management services that I've got, you'll notice that there's a first things first, there's a developer portal there. All right. I'm going to just next through all of this, but I do want you to notice that I can actually go and edit this. My AZ204 APIM service. I can go and brand this if I wanted to with our organizational branding. I can do quite a couple of things. You can see I can add things like pages. You can see I can view this with different settings and different form factors and all these sort of things. Tweak some of these images, for example. I want that to look like this, for example, and brand it according to our, corporate branding requirements. Save it, and you will see eventually when I'm done with it, I can click on the publish button. All right. So we've spoken a little bit about the front end. We've spoken a little bit about the back end. I haven't actually shown you these options yet, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Let's just say for now that I've created my service. So I've created the service is up and running. And what I want is I want to give an endpoint to my developers to go and say, here's a URL that you can use to actually go and interact with our API. Maybe you want to see what parameters are available, right? So that developer portal is a crucial part of the service, especially if you're planning to secure some of your APIs or products or things like that using something like a subscription. So let's take a look at that developer portal quickly. I'm going to head over there using another browser window here. So I'm going to click on sign in. I need to first sign up for that, of course. You can see there. And by the way, nothing is stopping me from sending an invite. So you can see there's users. I can click on invite in the Azure APIM service, and I can go and type someone's details and send them an invitation to go and do this. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign up. I'll add my my username and password. I'm going to go with my stock standard sort of password. In fact, let's just use the new one here. There you can see most of my credentials and details, and then it's got a little captcha here. XG, what's that, 4KW. Click on sign up. Of course, what's going to happen now in the meantime is if I go to my my email here, then within a few seconds, go on. Just waiting for that mail to pop through here. No, it's not there yet. It'll come through any minute now. There we go. So if I pop this out, you can see that there's the mail. Dear Johan Meiberg, thank you for joining the Microsoft API program. And, and a couple of links here. I'm going to just copy this link. I'm going to head back here and I'm going to go and just sign up there. There we go. Click on sign in. Thank you very much. And now I'm like a consumer of this API, right? I'm like a developer basically. And maybe what I want to do is I want to go look at these different APIs. Hey, which APIs are available? There you can see the Echo API. If I go for something like products, there you can see a starter, unlimited. If I click on starter here, for example, you can see I currently don't have any subscriptions on this API yet. I can take out a new one, something like a developer subscription. This has got nothing to do with the Azure subscription. Basically gives me credentials that I can use. And using these subscriptions, we can throttle, or we can even revoke access to the API if we wanted to. So what this means is we can even build commercial APIs, and if the customer hasn't paid their monthly subscription, we can start throttling them, and we can say, well, from now on, you're going to only get 5 requests per minute, right? So we use Azure policies to also apply some of those, some of that logic, if you want to see it like that. And then, so I've got a subscription now, but if I go back to my APIs and just click on the Echo API here, I want you to notice that there's a set of operations. There's enumerating the operations right now. There you can see that there is a retrieve resource. And if I click on try this operation, there you can see there's all the subscription keys that's been assigned to me already. There you can see there's additional parameters, a sample parameter, for example, and maybe a parameter number 2. There's some headers that I can add. I can, for example, in here, go and add a header if I wanted to, and there's the request. If I send it through within a few seconds, there you can see HTTP 100, okay, it's all good. It's got the information that I need. All right. So this basically, this developer portal also becomes almost like a type of test harness where you can test out some of these capabilities that we've got. I can also go to something called products, and you can see I can either go to an API, and for an API I can take out a subscription, but I can also go to my products. Then you can see there's my starter product, and I can go and create a subscription based on those different products. An API can belong to multiple products, by the way. All right, so the developer portal is a critical part of this. And if I go back to my APIM service here and scroll down to things like settings, deployment infrastructure, you will see that there's a variety of different options for me. Here is a list of all the notification templates, for example. So when a developer signs up, this is that message that I just said. Welcome to the organization name API, right? You can see there's a couple of these parameters. So I've got quite a bit of control over what's happening in the messaging that's coming from the developer portal. And that's something that, again, you want to brand and that you might want to control in a little bit more detail. You might also notice if I go to the developer portal, if I go for users, there you can see it's showing me my user here, right? That's of course the administrator credential, but there's also the developer that has just signed up. I signed up from the developer portal, hence it's added me to a developer group. But you will also see we've got the concept of groups, and these groups could be either the administrators, developers, or guests. Nothing is stopping me from creating a group, for example, my beta users, and adding some users into the beta group as well. We use these groups to control access and management of the different services and APIs in our environment. Right. First things first, here under the developer portal, once I create my developer portal, it has to be published the first time around. And if you want to test some of these features in the developer portal, like test those individual API operations, you're going to have to enable CORS, right? Cross-origin resource sharing. And because the reality is I might be using a web application from this URL, and this web application might be sending the request to this URL for the endpoint, right, for the API endpoint. And that, as you might know, might be seen as cross-site scripting by the browser, and it might actually stop something like that. So what we want to do is we want to enable CORS so that CORS is eventually configured for the service. And that, as you can see there, is effectively the name, the new endpoint that I'm going to be navigating to. So just to point something else out quickly, we've got a conference API. Let me just go dig it out here. I might as well just show it to you in here. If I go to my different APIs, there's my APIs. I've got the big conference version 1 here. Let me just quickly dig out this URL for a second. So that URL over there, big conference, right? So I should be able to just type bigconference.azurewebsites.net, and you'll notice that this URL, bigconference.azurewebsite.net, has essentially got a bunch of operations. If I go / something like sessions, for example, then you can see it's showing me a list of all the sessions for that conference. So what I effectively did earlier is I went to add an API here, and I chose from one of these options. Let me just put the font a little bit lower this time. There you can see there's all sorts of APIs that I can create a facade for, right? So if you're using something like GraphQL, if you've got WebSockets, if you want to manually define your HTTP endpoint in that context, there you can see there's a large language model API, right? So I can wrap something like OpenAI if I wanted to do that. gRPC, right? There's a couple of them, Waddle, WSDL, OData APIs, OpenAPI, right? And of course, from Azure, I might have a function app, I might have a logic app or app service that I want to point it to, right? So a couple of options. What I did earlier is I essentially just went in, pasted that URL, this URL, pasted that URL, and you'll notice that it'll effectively go and outline and complete all of these by default by me pointing it to the URL, basically getting that service description from that endpoint. Or I can go and upload a file. Now, by the way, folks, something that is definitely good to know is in here, you can see if I go for APIs, there's my Echo API. You will notice that we can go and download these different options. So your developer doesn't have to go and memorize the endpoint. All your developer needs to do is your developer needs to go and download this, and they can use that service description in their applications and services. And I can close that down and I can use that. Then further towards the bottom, there you can see it's the same one. It's prompting me here for a API URL suffix. In my case, I can go for something like conference. I've already used conf, so I cannot use conf again. There's the previous conference one is using that conf, suffix. And then you can see I can go and add things like tags, for example. This is something like UAT, for example, that sort of thing. And I can also go and link it with one or more products if I wanted to do something like that. I also have the option to version the API. I'm not going to version this API specifically, purely because I want to show you the differences between the APIs that are versioned and the ones that are not versioned, right? So I'm going to say that this is Big Conference Beta, and I'll just pop that in there as well. Hit the create button. It's not liking the name. It's probably because there's the word beta in there and a space. Ooh, didn't have to do that. There we go. Click on the create button, and you'll see the main difference between this API that I've just created here. That's the beta one that I just created. And this one is that the bottom one had versioning on. I'll talk about versioning right now. So when I create an API and I specify versioning, it will prompt me, and you'll see if I add an API or not that one. We'll see if I select this. And I go for full here, you can see that if I say version the API towards the bottom here, we can specify how do we want to specify the version using the path, using a header, using a query string parameter. And if I say, for example, v1 there, then you'll see it's actually going to pin that to the to the URL in that context. So if I say this is going to be something like conf, then it's going to show this version as version 1 under conf for that API management service. Now, there's two things to be mindful of when we're talking about versioning, because you'll notice if I go for v1 here and click on this, I can add a version. And you'll notice here immediately that we've got a version option, but we also have a revision option. Version is for breaking changes, right? If there's breaking changes that we realize if we take this live today, certain of our consumers, their apps are going to start breaking because we introduce some breaking changes here, right? Breaking changes, you'll create a brand new version. It'll say v2 now as opposed to v1 in the URL, and I can then continue with that version of the API management service. Revisions are for non-breaking changes. So you'll notice here that I can go and add a version, and when I'm adding a version, you can see there it's prompting me for the version identifier. I can go and specify something like v2 there, specify also something in the path. I'm going to specify v2, hit the create button, and you'll see immediately there's going to be popping out a version 2 of my API. And this is how I manage those breaking changes. I create a version 2, and for version 2, I can now go and change my configuration if I wanted to. However, you'll also notice we've got the concept of revisions. And as I mentioned, revisions are generally for non-breaking changes. So you can see I'm going to just specify this one as revision number 2. Now I've got 2 revisions here. And in actual fact, I'm going to add another one. There we go. Revision number 3. All right, so you can see there's different revisions. Now, as I said, revisions are for non-breaking changes. So as we roll out additional changes, here you can see this one is the current version. In order to access the current version, I just have to use that endpoint. If I wanted to use a specific revision, then I will specify revision 2 or revision 3 as an additional parameter for the endpoint. All right. However, once we are content, we want to move to revision 3, you can see there that we can say, make this the current version. Yes, thank you very much. Now, revision number 3 is the default revision. And if I wanted to use revision number 1, I have to specify revision number 1. And you can also see that if we made a mistake on one of these, that we can say revision 2 was a bit of a mess, we're going to take it offline. So we completely take it offline if we wanted to. All right. So versions. Hang on. Versions, revisions. Versions is for breaking changes. And revisions is for non-breaking changes. We're just adding another parameter, but it's optional, as an example. Right. We also have some great options here. You'll notice, for example, if I go to my Echo API, what I can do is I can add an operation. So let me just be quite clear about this. I've got a backend API that is providing 3 operations now. The one operation is maybe get balance. The other operation is transact, whatever that is, right? Do something else. And then the last one might be something like, perform something like a month end or whatever the case is. 3 different operations on my API. So if I wrap this API with API management services, of course, it's going to by default look the same. But now what if we want to start doing some additional development? And eventually, when we are done, there's going to be another operation here. And this operation is going to be called get profile. Right, so we're in development on the get profile operation right now. It's probably going to ship in about 2 weeks' time. What we want to do in the meantime is we want to give our developers a little taste of what that's going to look like without actually giving them real data. So what do? We go to our API management facade, we create a new operation there, and we give it we can give it even like a mock response where we can say, hey, this is the get profile operation, and right now there's some mock data. My developers can start calling this get profile operation. They can get some mock and sample data. They can see what that schema looks like, right? They can start integrating this into their application, maybe make it something like a feature flag or something like that. And one day when we are ready, we are going to go to this operation. We are going to make it active in production so that our production API can actually support that request. And then we are going to delete this mock return policy, and we are going to start feeding the data through to the backend. And one day the developer sits there and, whoa, hang on, it's showing me my profile data. The profile data starts coming through like that. It's also something that you might want to use to say, well, hang on for a second. We realize in Azure, there is an operation that gets your user profile information, or that does a language lookup, or whatever it might be. So what we can do in API management services is we can go and add additional backends, right? So as opposed to wrapping one of these existing APIs, take a look here. I can go and say, just scrolling down here a little bit, I can go to my backends here and I can say, hey, we've developed a completely different backend. And this backend has got this endpoint. There you can see a custom URL. And what we can do is, as we start migrating from our own APIs to maybe some of the Azure built-in APIs, we are going to start routing some of these requests over to Azure, for example. Right? So all of these operations that I'm talking about is basically done with policies in the Azure API Management Services environment. We'll talk about those in a bit more detail a little bit later on. All right, so we've got the gateway. Essentially, it can run on-prem or in the cloud. We've got and the gateway really becomes that front end, the facade or the wrapper for your API. And then we've got the back end. And then we've got the actual service, and you'll notice I also mentioned the developer portal there. Products is a different one. Let's say, for argument's sake, if I just pop back onto my drawing here, if I can find it. Let's say, for example, I've got the following scenarios. I've got authentication API, right? And then I've got what we would consider to be a free API that we can use. And this free API, we want to imply some limits on. We want to throttle that, for example. We might also have a complete enterprise API that we've got no limits on. So what we can do is we can say, well, we can group together in a free product, the authentication API and the free API. And for the enterprise customers, we can create a product called Enterprise. And with the Enterprise, you get the API with no limits, and you get the authentication as part of that as well, right? This API and that API might actually be the same API, but when we're calling it from a free subscription, we're going to implement some throttling there. When we're calling it from a paid subscription, we're going to remove some of those limits and thresholds, right? So the idea here is to use the whole structure to decide how we want to route some of these requests and what policies we want to apply. So there's a structure involved in API management services, and the structure in API management services is as follows. There's the service, there's products underneath that, then there's APIs, and then there's operations. So what I can do, and we'll take a look at policies in the next slide here. What we can effectively do now is we can apply some policies at that level. We can apply some policies at that level. We can apply policies at that level, or we can apply policies at that level. Now, if I can apply policies at each of these different levels, there has to be a mechanism for me to override this. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. Suffice to say that if I just draw it out like this, you might be thinking, gosh, Johan, what's the whole point here, right? If I'm just drawing it out like this, you might be saying, what's the point? It's actually just going to make my application slower, all right? If I look at this example here at the beginning, if I just look at this, plugging in this API management services between my calling applications and my actual API is going to put an overhead on those requests, without a doubt. So API management services has got gates. I like to call them gates. It's not an official term. I like to call them gates. There are 3 gates that we cater for in API management services. And at each of these gates, at each of those layers in the hierarchy, I can implement some policies. Let me give you an example. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. Right, there's my backend, there's my backend operation, there's my front end or facade operation. The first gate is known as the incoming gate, or it's on incoming. In other words, as the request comes into API management services, there is a gate, and we can ask certain questions about the request. We can perform certain operations on the request, add a header, remove a header, authenticate, for example. So we've got that token to use for authentication purposes. And if we decide we're okay with that, then we can send it off to the backend gate. In other words, as the request comes in, we can interact with those requests just before we send that request over to the backend. There's another gate here, right? Again, we can ask some questions, perform some operations on this request, and then finally, it's going to get forwarded to the backend. The backend is where the processing happens, and the backend will eventually return the information, and then eventually just before we send the response back to the calling application or client, there's another gate here that we can go and check some things, perform some operations on the request, add a header, remove a header, for example, and finally send the rest of the data, send the rest of the request back to the consuming application. So this is critical for us to understand, because if I pop over to the next slide here, you'll notice that this is what those policies look like. They're plain text XML-based policies. So at each level, at the service level, at product level, at API level, as well as individual operation level, we've got an XML document like this. And what we can do is we can say, all right, at this point in time, inbound, there you can see there's the inbound, there's the backend, and there's outbound. There are those three different gates that I've been talking about. Each of those is a gate, and at any one of these gates, I can inject a policy, and that policy will then apply to each of the requests that comes through that specific gate. Now that means that I might have a policy on my service that limits, the number of requests. I might have another policy on my API that limits the request. Which of these are the more important one, right? Which one is going to apply? If I've got two policies in the hierarchical structure, which policy is going to apply if I've got two similar policies here? And the answer is, you'll notice if you look at the XML behind this, you will see that the XML actually contains a base element. And the base element allows me to place all the policies that I want to inherit from the top down in that base element. So in other words, if there was a set header, policy in products, then as it is there, the one from the API will actually apply. If this policy was at that level, for example. So this will apply. If I place this policy inside that base element, then it'll apply the one from the products level. If I'm in products and I place it in the base element and there's another one at service level, then it'll apply that policy. So there's a hierarchical structure that's involved here, and you apply these policies at those levels based on how you want these requests to be routed, to and from your backend APIs. So let me demonstrate a couple of those just quickly. That was the backend API that I've shown to you. If I go to my APIs, you'll notice we've got a section there called All APIs. If I click on All APIs, this is essentially the policies for the entire service. And there you can see there's inbound, there's backend, there's outbound. There's the three gates. But remember, this now is at the highest level of the service, right? So these policies will apply to all products, all APIs, all operations. If I want to go down more to a product level and apply policies at a product level, there you can see there's a product. I created a product called Conference Pro. And if I look at Conference Pro and go to my policies, there you can see for this specific product, there's my gates: inbound processing, backend, and outbound. And again, if I go and click on base, there you can see there's the base element. There's the base element, right? And then lastly, the last two, there's my API. Remember, I can apply policies also to the API. There's my API, and you'll see within a few seconds, it's going to show me those three gates. There's the inbound processing, backend, outbound processing. Same thing if you go down to operational level, right? There's my operation, days get, whatever that is. There's the inbound processing, backend processing, and outbound processing. Right. So this structure, this hierarchical structure, is actually critical to understand if I'm working with this service at scale. And there you can also see there's a very nice example there of what you might be doing. Remember that you can only have one header with a specific name on an HTTP request. So in this context, what we're doing is we're setting a header. The request context data exists action is override. If it's there, override it, and you can see that there's several values there: value, the user ID, and the deployment region for that matter. All right. So you will control your requests as they come into the API on those different levels of that hierarchy based on the gate that you're in. Sometimes as the request comes in, you don't even want to send it to the backend. You want to immediately just send it back to the end user. I also want to quickly show you adding an operation, get profile, as I mentioned earlier on, Gert profile, it's Afrikaans name. You can see there, get profile slash profile. Proper description there. There you can see query, headers, requests, and there you can see some responses. What am I doing here? I'm giving a response. It's going to be a HTTP 200, and there you can see I can add a content representation, right? I can go with something like text JSON or something like that, right? Or, there we go, application, or application JSON or whatever it might be. There we go. And I can go and give it a little sample here of what this is going to look like, specify a definition, and say that, hey, this is what that's going to look like. So we don't have to always process the request and send it to a backend. We can stop that request and send back an example of what that looks like. There's several different policies that we can use for this. I want to just briefly head out here to courses. Which one is this? AZ204, APIM. Here's Azure API Policy Management Reference. Take a look at all these policies, folks. There's a huge amount of them. Rate limiting and quotas. Limit rate by subscription. So I can go and say, each subscription, and if I click through on one of these, you can see there's an example, right? Rate limit calls, the renewal period, X amount of seconds. And then you can see try after variable name, remaining calls header. We've got complete control over that. There you can see limit call rate by key. And in this case, we can specify, hey, we want X amount of calls possibly per minute. We will allow 20 calls per minute or something like this. So you've got quite a bit of flexibility in terms of rate limiting and assigning quotas to different subscriptions. That's certainly one way of doing that. But you'll also see under authentication, we can check for a HTTP header. If I wanted to, I can validate the Entra ID token. If I wanted to, I can validate a JSON web token if I wanted to. Or validate a client certificate, right? How do I validate a client certificate, right? You can see there is I can specify identity, the thumbprint, the serial number, all of these. And that means as the request comes in, we check this, we see the thumbprint doesn't match. Sorry, you're not authenticated, right? You need to first authenticate or provide some sort of an error to the user. Content validation. You'll notice that we can look at the content and we can see, does it match this schema, right? Talking about schemas, if I scroll to the back here, you will see that there's my schemas. I can go and define schemas. The user profile input request is going to look like this. If it doesn't match this request, then there's something wrong. So we can go and possibly then say, well, was the request authenticated, and apply some if logic to those different APIs. So you'll notice if I go for routing, there's a forward request. Very often what you want to do is the request comes in. Here's my operations. The request comes in. We first want to send it somewhere else. There's another operation there somewhere. Then we're going to come back and then we're going to forward it to the backend API. Right? So at any point in time, we can also just forward the request, and we can specify forward this request to whatever backend we want to forward the request to. Right? And you can see that there's some limits in terms of timeouts and things like this. The last couple of ones, there's a caching component here as well. This is also quite interesting because you'll notice if I scroll down in my environment here, there's something called the external cache. And what we can do here is we can create a Redis compatible cache. There you can see use it from Azure or wherever I want to use it for. And I can actually go and create a Redis cache where we can be storing some values. Talking about values though, of course, we've got things like Credential Manager here, right? And with Credential Manager, we can essentially use things like managed identities. But probably the one that might make a little bit more sense to talk about quickly is adding one of these named values. A named value is almost like a type of variable that I can use, and you'll see that this could be something that is either a plain variable, a secret, or I can be referencing something from the key vault for that matter. Now, these named values would be something that you might use in your different policies, right? You can see there's an example of setting a header, right? I might want to make this value X request context data. I might want to make this a variable name, so I can use those named values to say, well, this header name is going to be dollar whatever variable 5 or whatever that needs to be. I mentioned the backends. If you want to reuse some of these policies, you can also create a policy fragment. And these policy fragments could be 5 or 6 different policies that you've strung together and that you use over and over in some of your in some of those gates, if you like. So one of the last things, just briefly, I did want to talk about, of course, there's going to be things like custom domains here. There's the self-hosted gateway scenario that I alluded to early on. And then you'll also notice if I just scroll down a little bit, there's something called a repo, right? The repository. And in this context, what I can do is you will see that we're going to give you basically a Git endpoint. That's the repository URL. You can see for credential purposes, we can go and generate Git credentials, and we can generate the Git primary and secondary key. And what this means is if I go to my different policies here, and let's just go to my Echo API quickly, and if I look at some of these. Now, this will actually be on my products quickly. There is the starter product. There's my policies, and you'll see the starter product has got a rate limit. It's got a quota. All of these, and of course, I can essentially go and take all of these XML API management policies, persist that all to the Git endpoint that allows me to extract the information via GET request. And then once I've got the information, we can be doing development in our development API management instance, do a configuration, a proper configuration setup there, export the configuration to an endpoint, push the configuration to another endpoint, to this API management service specifically. And then you'll see further to this, what we can do is we can then also, deploy from this Git endpoint into API management services. So this allows me to save it, and this allows me to take whatever is in that repo and hand it over to API management service and apply that configuration to my API management instance and services. Right, and that's at a high level. Just what we wanted to talk about. In securing the APIs, this is something you'll notice that's important to understand. If I go down to my API level and I click on my big conference beta, for example, and select settings here, you should see that there is an option, right? In order to use the beta API, I have to provide a subscription key. There's also different types of subscription keys. You should see that if I go to subscriptions here, it's going to show that one subscription that I took out as a developer. Take a second to load here. 4 minutes left. There we go. There's that subscription that Johannes taken out, and you'll notice that I can go and say, well, suspend the subscription, cancel the subscription, delete it, show hide the keys, roll the keys if the customer contacted us and said to us, hey, Johan, our key has been compromised. How do we deal with that? And then lastly, folks, just from a course perspective, I thought it's actually a good idea just to show you a couple of things. There you can see securing APIs by using certificates. This is effectively, from the actual learn material, and you can see that there's a couple of examples of what some of these options might look like. You can see there's a when condition there, and then when condition, check the thumbprint. Validate the thumbprint against the certificate that's been uploaded to APIM. Check the issuer, right? Examples like that. So there's a couple of options around that. And then also there's some policies, for example, for authentication purposes. There's conditional policies that we can apply in API management services. And that brings me to a conclusion here. I want to leave some time for some questions. We're almost out of time. Why API management services? I can tell you now, this is not a tool that you'll implement if you've got one or two APIs. This is a tool that you will know that you will need this tool before you buy the tool, right? You're going to have a need for this. Your APIs might be changing so much that you struggle with control over the APIs. So in this instance, I would say that there will be a need for API management services before you buy it, right? Someone will go like, we're spending half our time managing APIs and requests and these sort of things. How do we do that better? API management services will help you to manage those APIs at scale and also control access to internal and both external APIs using a developer portal that you can expose to your consumers of the applications. Some of the concepts, just briefly, the concepts, what is the gateway? That's important, but also things like the structure, right? You remember that structure. There's the service. Under the service, you've optionally got products, then there's APIs, and then there's the operations, and there's also various ways to ensure that the request is authenticated. We can check for authentication, or we can do authentication using the authentication policies. And that brings me to the end here. Are there any questions? I'm sure there will be questions. Mr. Developer has got to have some questions. I'll be surprised if we don't see anything from him.
Mr. Programmer, he was not in the chat today, so if you're here, please answer hello. So we received a question from Pablo. APIM and external access deserves a series for itself. So maybe thoughts on that? What do you think?
Hang on for a second. Let me just read the whole one. APIM and external access deserves a series for itself. Look, I'll be honest with you. You can probably spend in our Azure developer course, we usually do API management services in the morning. So we start at 9 o'clock. We take 1 or 2 breaks, and we end off more or less 12 o'clock. So you're 100% right. We can probably spend 4 hours. I would have loved to show you some additional demos where I've got an application that I can now point to API management services and show you how some of that works. But you're 100% correct. All of these topics we cover in the series, in our course, we spend 3 to 4 hours on those topics. So that's 100% correct. All right. I hope that answered that question.
The next question, is it possible to set up an API to the front end of a Power BI dashboard?
Well, remember, API is not something that has a user interface, all right? So does a Power BI dashboard have an API? If it has an API that returns some raw data that you will consume from a web application or a Windows or a mobile type application, then you might do that. But if you are not familiar with an API, typically we've got something like an application, and the application calls an API. Applications generally have user interface. There is no UI here, right? Power BI has got a user interface. So I'm not sure why you would want something to wrap Power BI as an API if Power BI has a user interface. I'm not sure if that answers your question, right? So the short answer is if it doesn't have a programmatic interface, an API that returns something like JSON, API is not the way to go. You don't want to throttle requests to Power BI. You know what I mean. Maybe you want to, but API management services is not the right way for that. All right, APIM. Is it possible? Yeah, right. Another question. Something about APIM management and MCPs. I see there's another question there. That is a brand spanking new feature there. I only saw this about a week ago. So no, as part of the course, we're not going to talk about something that is in preview right now. So yeah, that's previous stuff. It's not actually part of what we're going to be talking about. Is there uh, is there any future Azure DevOps event? Look, folks, if you want us to schedule a series like this around the AZ400, let us know. I'm sure we can do something like that.
Uh, there's another question from Pablo. Is APIM a good candidate for web apps that are interfaces to AI agents?
Well, is the AI agent a user interface, or again, is it an API, right? We have to differentiate between what is a user interface and what is an API. And if something has got an API that you access programmatically, you might want to use something like this. But if you want to put something on top of a user interface, it doesn't make sense to do that, right? So it's a little bit like me saying, you know, we are going to create a bus route from my house to the train station, and then we create a bus station here. We put a bus station by the train station, and then we create a bus, and the bus starts driving up and down between the two stations. Now suddenly we say, hey, we want to do this faster, so we're going to buy an aeroplane. All right, it doesn't make sense to have an aeroplane. Aeroplane cannot land here, right? Just like that, if I've got something like if I've got an API, the API returns data. It doesn't return user interface. So if the AI agents, whatever you mean by that, it's a very wide term. If the AI agents return some data, yeah, then it makes sense to do that. But also remember, we're talking about scale here, right? So if there's not a specific reason for you to take control of those requests, API management services might just be a complete over-engineered solution. You've just got one API and one front end. API management is not for those scenarios typically. It's where you want to control massive amounts of APIs, control those requests, and take control over individual requests and check certain things out, right? So like I said, this is something that you'll have a need for before you start looking for a product. I hope that answered the question, right? So if it doesn't have an API, if it doesn't return data, API management services will not work for that. It's not meant to sit on something that doesn't return data. HTTP data, of course. All right, Pablo, I hope that answered your question. It's a big pleasure. I hope you guys learned as much as possible.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you. Yeah, and if you guys have any more questions, you can contact or show it in the at the beginning of the session, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. So that's a wrap for today's session. And thank you all for joining. And thank you, Johan, for the content today. We are always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. So if you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find the link on the screen or in the chat. We'll see you on the next one.